this episode of the Burnzo Cast, we have the 8-bit Nintendo years. Welcome everybody to episode number 8 of the Burnzo Cast. I am your host, Matt Burns, speaking. So the last 2 episodes of the Burnzo Cast have been video game related. The first one was about the Nintendo 64, and the second one was about a favorite video arcade from my childhood called the Dream Machine. In this episode, we're going to stick to this video game theme, make a little trilogy, if you will, and talk about the very first video game system my family ever owned, which was the 8-bit Nintendo. But before we get into that, yep, you guessed it, we're going to take a little quick break so we can hear a word from our sponsor. Don't worry, it'll be quick, I promise. Psych! Hello there, Walter. How's it going?
Oh, not so good. I talked to my doctor earlier today, and my worst fears have come true. Brain rot.
Well, that's because you've been reading Brand X books. Brand X books have been clinically proven to rot your brain. Have you considered switching to books by Matt Burns? His books are available on Amazon.com now. Many of them cost only 99 cents. At most, you're only going to pay about $3. Unlike books by Brand X, books by Matt Burns not only reinforce and strengthen brain cells, but they actually help create more cerebral cortex in your frontal lobe.
And to think I've been reading Brand X books all this time. From this day forward, I'll read no book unless it's by Matt Burns.
You are listening to Burnzo Cast Radio.
All right, welcome back to the Burnzo Cast. Again, this is episode number 8. It's called the 8-bit Nintendo years. And let's do this. Do this. Do this. Do. Okay, I'll stop. So before I talk about the 8-bit Nintendo, I want to take you back a little bit to the early to mid 1980s and talk about my earlier video gaming years, pre-Nintendo. In the early 1980s, my family had this strange computer. I don't even know what it was called, but it was basically a keyboard that you plugged into a television set, and I think there was a joystick you could use as well. The keyboard functioned as a small hard drive, and there were 2 or 3 games that you could play on this thing. The first game was a ripoff of Space Invaders, and I remember the aliens were made out of square pixels, but they somehow managed to scare the crap out of me, to be honest with you. The second game was a ripoff of Pac-Man and consisted of a mouse-like icon running through a maze eating cheese. There may have been other games on this poor excuse for a computer, but the Aliens game and the mouse game are the only ones I remember. Again, I was probably about 3 or 4 years old at this time, but I do remember my siblings playing these games a lot. I probably watched them play more than I played, but we would plug this computer into a small black and white television set that we had. This wasn't the main TV of the house, but more like a backup television that was usually in my parents' bedroom, but was small enough to be carried into other rooms if need be. At some point, maybe around 1985 or 1986, I remember going over to my cousin's house, and they had an Atari. Now, I'm not sure which version of Atari they had. It was possibly the 7800. But I remember them showing my siblings and I the game Joust, which to me basically looked like this guy riding an ostrich, going around killing other ostriches. The sound effects in the game gave me the willies, especially the sounds of the ostriches or whatever those things were called that kind of got born out of those pits. It kind of went, you know what I mean? Yeah, I was definitely creeped out by that game and those sound effects. Again, I was very young, so it doesn't take much to scare a 3 or 4-year-old. I mean, I was honestly scared of Maria on Sesame Street when she dressed up as Charlie Chaplin. There was something about that square mustache. Maybe I was in a concentration camp in my past life, and the square mustache reminded me of Hitler. I don't know, but Maria definitely freaked me out on Sesame Street. That's a little side note there. But it does show that I was kind of creeped out by the smallest of things. Anyway, my cousins also showed us the game Breakout, and for that game you would switch from the joystick Atari controllers to the paddle controllers. Those were the controllers that had the dial on them that could turn clockwise and counterclockwise. Breakout, if you don't know, is a game where you essentially bounced a ball back and forth against a wall of bricks with a small bar that moved back and forth with the paddle controller. You would clear a level as soon as you broke a hole through the wall and got the ball to go through to the other side. It was basically like playing tennis with the wall. Now, I should mention that at one point I did own an Atari myself, but this came later, after I had already had a Nintendo Entertainment System. I was maybe 10 years old or so at this time, and there was a yard sale in my neighborhood. At the yard sale, I saw that they were selling an Atari that was in superb condition. Multiple joysticks included, both the actual joysticks and the paddle controllers. And even better, 50 Atari games were included. And all of this was being sold for about $20. But even $20 at the time was too expensive for me, or maybe my parents thought it was too expensive for me. Either way, I think the person running the yard sale agreed that if nobody came and bought the Atari by the end of the day, they would sell the console and the games to me along with the controllers, all for only $10. Fortunately, at the end of the day, nobody had purchased the Atari, so I did end up getting everything for $10. The only slight disappointment was that somebody had come and bought a few of the 50 games earlier in the day, and the game I had my eye on the most, which was Pitfall, was gone. But I couldn't complain. Getting an Atari and tons of games, maybe 40 plus games, controllers, etc., for only $10 was certainly nothing to complain about. I really got a good deal there. I did end up playing the Atari quite a bit, but as the years went by, the console got more and more difficult to hook up to the more modern 1990s era televisions. I remember the Atari had this coaxial hookup thing that looked like crab claws. I probably could have gotten an adapter at Radio Shack that would have made it easier to hook up the Atari to the more modern televisions, but I never really made this effort. As the 1990s went forward, I played the Atari less and less, and eventually I think it ended up in my attic. In 2006, I sold the Atari and all the games to this place called Play and Trade in the Walpole Mall, and oh man, I got so ripped off there. I think the game sold for 30 cents each, and the actual Atari console sold for only a few dollars. Now, I think selling my Sega Game Gear to Play and Trade was my biggest regret in life, but selling the Atari is definitely up there as well. Oh man, I cringe just thinking about it now. It's a very traumatic experience. Anyway, going back to the 1980s again, eventually in 1986, the Nintendo Entertainment System was officially released in America. I remember seeing a demo of the NES in a Lechmere store located in Dedham, Massachusetts, which no longer exists, God rest its soul. If you want to learn a bit about Lechmere, check out my episode 2 podcast, A Love Letter to the Emerald Square Mall. I do talk about it briefly in there. But I specifically remember that the demo I saw in Lechmere showed World 1-2 in Super Mario Bros., the first underground level in the game. I was still very young, about 4 years old, so I don't remember my exact emotions when seeing this demo, but I do know I was somewhat entranced by it. I knew that what I was looking at was really new, different, and cool. But the NES was too expensive at this point, probably around $200. We needed to wait for the price to go down before we mainly meaning my brother and I, even began a conversation with our parents about buying one. By the spring of 1987, the Nintendo Entertainment System had dropped in price. I think the console alone was about $100 by this point. I'm not sure if I played any part in convincing my dad to purchase the Nintendo because I was only about 5 years old at this time. So I'll give all the credit to my brother here and say that he convinced my dad to finally buy a Nintendo Entertainment System at Lechmere. And I think this was sometime around the spring of 1987. And I'm pretty sure it was around this time because we bought the game Rush and Attack as our first game, and I know Rush and Attack was a new game around this time, and when you look up the release date for Rush and Attack, it's April of 1987, so I'm pretty sure that's around the time when we bought the Nintendo Entertainment System. Also, I should probably put on the record that I think my brother paid for at least half of the Nintendo, or maybe even all of it, using his money that he made as a Patriot Ledger and Boston Globe paperboy. So, at the most, I think my dad only paid about $50. Maybe that was the deal that they made with each other. But it's also possible my brother paid for the entire thing with his paper route money. But again, the catch was that, yes, the console was only about $100, but it didn't come with Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt, nor did it come with the Zapper gun. In other words, it wasn't the Nintendo Entertainment System action set. It was just the console, no games. I'm not sure if I was present when the NES was purchased, but I do have this vague memory of being in Lechmere browsing through games that were hanging from one of those pegged walls, or maybe they were in a display case. I could be making this memory up, but I seem to remember seeing the box art for Rush and Attack and thinking it looked really cool. And then my brother and I mutually decided that this should be the first game we owned for the NES. Again, I could be making all that up, but either way, I do know that the very first game we owned for the Nintendo was Rush and Attack, released by Konami in 1987. Now, I always assumed that Rush and Attack was really Russian Attack and not Rush and Attack. It's really Rush and Attack, not Russian Attack, as in Russians. It wasn't until recently that I looked closely at this title and realized that the game was never specifically about Russians attacking. Instead, the game description was rather vague. You play as an American Special Operations soldier and try to destroy a secret enemy weapon being developed on an enemy base. The game's description is not specific about who this enemy is, but, I mean, come on. Obviously, the enemy is the Russians, folks. You start out the game armed with nothing but a knife and start killing as many as many enemies as possible. Later in the game, you can get a missile launcher, a pistol, and grenades. Rush and Attack was definitely a difficult game, especially for a 5-year-old like myself. It probably would have been better if I started out my NES experience playing Super Mario Bros. Or something a little more easy. But then again, now that I think of it, Super Mario Bros. Isn't that easy either. In fact, most Nintendo games were hard, and I think this was because Nintendo and other video game developers in the mid to late 1980s were new to making games for home consoles, and instead were still in the video arcade game mode, where you needed to make games hard so that gamers didn't make it far off one quarter alone, and actually, they would end up coughing up more quarters in order to reach new levels, and especially to beat the game. In short, hard games meant more profits for the game makers. Also, most Nintendo games were ported arcade games, that is, they originated as arcade games. And although they may have been watered down a little bit in terms of their difficulty, they still were often as difficult as their arcade versions. Rush and Attack, after all, was initially an arcade game before it was a home NES console game. But yes, despite Rush and Attack's difficulty and despite the fact that I rarely even made it beyond the first level, I still fell in love with Rush and Attack and the NES in general. I mean, it was my very first Nintendo game after all, and really my very first video game altogether. That is, if you don't count those Alien Invader and Pac-Man ripoffs we had. My memory might be hazy, but I don't think we officially owned a second video game for several months after getting the NES and the Rush and Attack cart. Cart is a fancy and pretentious way of saying game, just so you know. I'm sure we rented several games from the local Video Paradise video store and probably borrowed a lot of games from friends and kids around the neighborhood. But I don't think it was until that next Christmas of 1987 that we owned a second video game. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think this game was a little game called Ghosts and Goblins, released by Capcom in November of 1986. Like Rush and Attack, Ghosts and Goblins was also originally an arcade game, and also like Rush and Attack, it was hard, but actually even harder than Rush and Attack. I mean, we're talking super hard here. In Ghosts and Goblins, you are some kind of knight, I believe, and I'm saying this without even looking up the game on Wikipedia because I think my memory of the game is probably more interesting than the reality of the game itself. But I'm pretty sure you're a knight in medieval times and you start the game naked in a graveyard hanging out with a princess. Or at least you're in your boxer shorts, I guess not completely naked. I don't know if the implication is that you just did the dirty things with the princess or what, but either way, a demon comes flying down from the skies, kidnaps the princess. You, the knight, is pissed off. You put on some armor, and then you start your quest to save the princess. In this quest, there are many ghosts and goblins, demons, ghouls, and such. Alright, maybe I was just a big wuss, but this game creeped me out just like fake Alien Invaders, and also just like Joust did for the Atari. I was maybe 6 years old by the time I started playing Ghosts and Goblins, but it was kind of creepy in an 8-bit pixels kind of way. The music and sound effects especially gave me the heebie-jeebies. But yeah, the game was so hard. I mean, the controls were so, what's the word, like unflexible or blocky or something, especially if you were used to playing a game like Super Mario Brothers. I just remember that you had to be a lot more precise about jumping over a cliff, much more so than in Super Mario Brothers. You had to jump right at the last minute in order to make it over the cliff. Up was up, down was down, but it was harder to move in a 45-degree angle, if you know what I mean. And the game was very unforgiving. I think if you were hit by an enemy once, you lost your armor and you were naked, but still in the game. If you get hit twice, though, it's game over. Maybe you could start back at the beginning of the level, but I feel like you only had a couple continues. There wasn't much grace in this game. In fact, the game was so hard that for a while I actually thought there was something wrong with it, that, it was flawed and had glitches and bugs in it. I soon learned that this wasn't the case, though, when I was on the bus one day and this kid named Dan told me he beat the game, and he also beat it with not much of a problem. See, I had great respect for this Dan. He was a few years older than me, and he sat in the special one-seater, or was it a two-seater? I'm not really sure, but it was that special seat that was located right near the emergency exit of the school bus. But for whatever reason, that seat was basically reserved for the coolest kid on the bus, and Dan was by far the coolest kid on the bus, so that's where he always sat, no questions asked. I mean, nobody dared sit in this seat until Dan moved on to high school. But yeah, Dan claimed to have beaten Ghosts and Goblins pretty much without a big problem, and I remember being in such disbelief when I heard this. Again, I literally thought the game was defective and that it was impossible to beat. Guess not, though. I guess Dan beat it. Many years later, I would learn that Ghosts and Goblins was not only not defective and carelessly thrown together, but it's actually considered to be one of the best video games for Nintendo, despite its tough controls and overall level of difficulty. Part of the reason why Ghosts and Goblins was so frustrating to play was that there weren't any codes you could use for the game. Or at least I don't think there were any codes. I liked the Konami games the best because they, of course, had that famous up, up, down, down code that would give you about, 30 lives or so. One of these games that you could use the code for was Contra. And although I never officially owned Contra, I vividly remember being introduced to the game probably somewhere in the area of the summer of 1988. I had this neighbor named Lee, and I remember going to his house where he had some other neighborhood kids over, and they'd be playing the game Contra. I don't even know if I played the game at all. I may have tried it out here and there, but this was one game that I remember being totally content to just watch it being played. In fact, I think I enjoyed watching the other kids playing the game more than I did playing it myself. In this game, you play as an American Special Operations soldier, but you're not fighting the Russians in this one. You're fighting an evil army known as the Red Falcon Organization. So, yeah, basically a bunch of red commies and, basically the Russians. The year is 2633, that is 2633, and the Red Falcon Organization is under the influence of an evil alien entity. Your mission is to destroy the Russians. Scratch that, I mean the Red Falcons. And also destroy that pesky alien entity. Contra was a super fun game, hard to play without the code. But if you had the code, it was a ton of fun and you could usually beat the game. The only problem, though, was that I usually had a lot of trouble doing the code. A year or two after seeing the game be played at Lee's house, I somehow acquired a copy of Contra. I think I probably borrowed it from a friend and never returned it. This happened a lot. Sorry, friends out there. But I remember having a hell of a time typing the code. The timing of the code had to be perfect. When you first turned on the game, there was this brief intro with 4 notes of music and then an explosion sound. Kind of went like this. Do, 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 do. You had to type the code in during this intro, and I think you had to finish typing in the code before the explosion sound, at least if my memory serves me correctly. All I know is I had a lot of trouble pulling off the code unless I had some help from Lee up the street or another neighborhood friend who knew what they were doing. I did have better luck, however, with another Konami game, one that was very similar to Contra, and that game was called Life Force. Life Force was a lot like Contra, except instead of you being a special ops soldier, you were a spaceship flying through a giant alien's body. And instead of battling members of the Red Falcon Army, you were battling, well, various smaller alien life forms within a larger alien. The aliens, of course, were basically symbolic of the Russians, but that goes without saying, right? It was a lot easier, for whatever reason, to pull off the code in Life Force. With the code, I was able to beat the game and had tons of fun doing so. On a random note, I remember one alien life form in the game looked like beets, and what I'm talking about here is the vegetable beets. Just thought I would mention that. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Life Force wasn't a game I owned until later, maybe even close to the 1990 area. I think my third Nintendo game that I officially owned after Ghosts and Goblins was RC Pro-Am, and this may have been a Christmas gift as well, sometime around the 1988 area. RC Pro-Am was one of the 2 main racing games that were available for the Nintendo, the other being Rad Racer. Rad Racer had the behind-the-car third-person view, but RC Pro-Am had the overhead view, and the cars in the game weren't race cars, but they were actually remote control cars. Rad Racer was definitely a fun game, but I think I liked RC Pro-Am better. I remember there were a lot of levels in RC Pro-Am, but at one point in the game, if you were playing against the computer, the orange car would go absolutely berserk, go about 3 times as fast as normal, and absolutely destroy you. I mean, there was no beating it at that point. I always thought this was a glitch in the game, but I don't think it was. I basically just learned to accept the fact that at around level 12 or so, the orange car would eat a can of turbo spinach and go absolutely berserk, drive around the track 3 times as fast, and leave everyone in the dust. In fact, the orange car going berserk was usually an indication that I had been playing the game for far too long. It was time to shut it off and go do my homework. Oh, but one other thing I should mention about RC Pro-Am is that around the same time that I got this game, we also got an NES Advantage joystick, which was this really cool-looking arcade-like controller you could use in place of your normal NES controller. It had a joystick instead of a D-pad and bigger A and B buttons. It also had these turbo buttons, but as far as I can remember, I don't think those buttons ever did anything. The controller wasn't that practical for games like Super Mario Bros. And Russian Attack, but it actually worked great for RC Pro-Am. Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that also around this time when I was playing RC Pro-Am, Russian Attack, Contra, etc., I was also introduced to the game The Legend of Zelda. I never owned this game until about 1992 when I was in the 5th grade, but I'll get into that in just a second. My first exposure to the game was definitely at my cousin's house, and these were the same cousins who had first exposed me to the Atari. I remember playing the game at their house, but I also think they would bring the game over to our house when they came over for dinner or for a Christmas party or something like that. And then we would play all as a group. One person would man the controls. It was never me, trust me. But everyone in the group would offer their input as to where they thought Link should go or what bush to burn, what rock to bomb, what stone to bush, etc. I'm pretty sure I mainly watched them play over anything else, but I remember thinking it was such a fun game. That being said, however, I should mention that I of course thought this game was spooky as well. Yeah, I was a wuss, apparently scared by many video games. Each labyrinth in the game gave me the willies, mainly because of the mysterious sounding music that was featured in these levels. I also got scared when you were one room over from the labyrinth boss and you would start hearing those dragon-like noises. You know what I mean? It kind of sounded like a digital-like sneeze. Something like that. That's a horrible impression. This let you know that you were close to the boss when you heard those sounds. Other things that scared me in the game were the old man and the old woman who would give you those clues, the letters, the medicine and such. They were comprised of just a few 8-bit pixels, but for some reason those old men and women who lived like hermits in the caves gave me the major creeps. But yeah, I never actually owned The Legend of Zelda until much later. I think I already had a Super Nintendo at this point. But during the summer between 5th and 6th grade, I went to KB Toys in the local mall and bought The Legend of Zelda. Probably for a really good price at that point too, because again, the NES was kind of old news at that point and Super Nintendo was all the rage. My mission for that summer was to beat the game, but I didn't end up beating it. I probably only got to like level 6 or something like that. But many years later, and I'm talking many years later, like only a few years ago in 2021, I got a Nintendo 3DS, which had the Virtual Console, where you could download old school NES games. I decided to download and beat The Legend of Zelda once and for all. Well, not only did I beat it once, but I beat it like twice, guys, okay? Are you impressed? Do you want my autograph? All right, no selfies. No selfies, guys. It was super fun to beat The Legend of Zelda. Definitely, it got hard towards the last few levels, but I really had a fun time beating it. But yeah, for the most part, we only owned a handful of games for the NES. Most of these games were either given to me or my brother for birthdays or Christmas. There is, however, one exception, and that would be a game called Rampage, which stands out in my memory as the only game I ever got for no reason. No birthday, no Christmas, or anything like that. Here's the story behind Rampage. I was at this mall called the Braintree Mall, it's now called the South Shore Plaza, right outside Boston one Saturday with my dad. I'm not sure what we were after that day. There was a sports store called Herman's there in the mall that I know we went to a lot. So that may have been why we were at the mall that day, to get some baseball mitts or something like that. But I remember going into KB Toys in the Braintree Mall and seeing this brand new game called Rampage hanging on the wall behind the front counter. I think there was a lot of buzz surrounding the game, or maybe the KB Toys clerk was raving about how popular the game was. Whatever it was, I thought I needed to have the game. My dad didn't like the looks of the price, though. It was about $60 or maybe even $80, something crazy like that. He said he would think about it, and we went off to do some other shopping. Well, for the next hour or so, I think I pulled out every subtle manipulation tactic I had in my arsenal. Dad, I'll never ask for anything ever again, Dad. Dad, did you know playing video games help boost brain cells? Dad, my teacher at school wants me to play Rampage for extra credit, I swear. Okay, I didn't say that latter part, but I know I kept bothering him about Rampage. Eventually, my dad did cave, and he bought the game on the condition that I would never, ever, ever tell my mom about this extremely frivolous purchase. I told him that I love you so much, Dad. I literally thought that I would be happy for the rest of my days once I got Rampage. I went home, popped the game into my NES, and the game wasn't that great. The plot basically involved you playing as either a Godzilla-like monster or a King Kong-like monster, and you destroyed city buildings while the military shot at you in tanks. You literally just climbed buildings, punched at them, ate an occasional person or snack, and you did this until the building was so weak it crumbled to the ground. Then you proceeded to the next level and did the same thing to another group of buildings. You kept on doing this in level after level upon level after level. There were about 100 levels in the game, guys. By about level 20, the game got so old, and pretty soon you would just want to quit and shut it off. I don't think you could even save your progress in the game. If you quit, you would have to start at level 1 the next time. So yeah, unfortunately, the game didn't live up to its hype, but I never dared tell my dad that the game was not as great as I thought it would be. It would have broken his heart because, again, I think he spent about $80 on this game. Nevertheless, Rampage will forever go down as the one game I got randomly at the mall one day, not for a birthday present, not for a Christmas present, and not for an Easter present. Wait, Easter present, you're saying? That's right, you heard me correctly. I remember one year for Easter, I was pleasantly surprised to find a Nintendo game in my Easter basket. This was a one-time deal, though. I don't think I ever got such a big-ticket item in my Easter basket ever again after that one year. But I did get one that year for whatever reason. Maybe I was getting good grades in school, who knows. What game was it, you may be asking? It was this game called Jackal. Jackal was another Konami game, originally an arcade game, no surprise there, and released for the Nintendo in October of 1988. This was an overhead angle game, much like RC Pro-Am. You're in a Special Forces Army Jeep that gets dropped off in enemy territory, which is code for Russia, of course. Your mission is to pick up POWs and ultimately destroy a secret enemy weapon. I don't think there's much more to say about Jackal except that I loved it, and it was a really fun game to play. I don't think there was an up-up-down-down code you could use on this game, but I'm not sure about that. I just know that Konami always made awesome games, and Jackal was definitely no exception. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 was no exception either. That's right, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, probably was my favorite Nintendo game of all time. My first exposure to the game was not on the NES, but in a random outlet mall right by the Bourne Bridge on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. My family was at Old Silver Beach in Falmouth for the day, maybe even with my aforementioned cousins. And on the way home, we went to this outlet mall for something to eat, and also to do a little shopping at the Bass Shoe Outlet. Bass shoes were popular in the 1990s for whatever reason, but that's not important right now. I remember there was a small food court in the outlet mall, and in this food court was a video arcade game that absolutely blew me away. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. In the game, you play as one of the 4 Ninja Turtles and try to save both April and Splinter after they've been kidnapped by the evil Shredder. In your New York City travels, you battle foot soldiers, robots, Bebop, and even Rocksteady. At the time, I was already a huge fan of both the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon series and especially, and I emphasize, especially the 1990 live-action movie. And I really want to emphasize that I was a huge fan of this movie. In fact, I could probably do a whole nother podcast on my love for the 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. But yeah, the video game was like taking the cartoon and turning it into a video game. In fact, that's kind of what it felt like, that you were playing the cartoon and interactively engaging with the cartoon. The arcade game was eventually ported to the Nintendo in December of 1990, and I think I may have gotten it for my birthday just a few weeks later in January of 1991. It quickly turned into my favorite video game to play. I'm pretty sure you could do the Konami code for it, or maybe it was just easier to play than other games, because I know that I did eventually end up beating the entire game, and I don't remember it being an overly difficult feat to accomplish. My favorite level in the game was by far the one where you skateboarded. I had so much fun playing that game. I think I played as Raphael a lot and maybe Donatello, but come to think of it, I don't think there was necessarily a turtle I liked more than the others. I think I played with them almost in equal amounts. You know, little Michelangelo here, little Leonardo, etc. Also, on a side note, I remember the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 game cartridge came with a coupon for a free personal pan pizza at Pizza Hut. I never ended up using that coupon, mainly because I never went to Pizza Hut as a child. I was more of a Papagino's kind of kid. I think I can only remember maybe one time going to Pizza Hut, but I don't even know if I actually got pizza there. I think I just went there with a friend one time real quick. I wonder if I still actually have that coupon somewhere. I wonder if they would still honor it. You know, like how crazy would that be if I went into Pizza Hut with a coupon for a free personal pan pizza from 1991? So insane nuts, I tell you. It'd just be so nuts. Around the time that I was playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 in the early 1990s, there were also 3 other games that were in pretty heavy rotation within my Nintendo Entertainment System. One of these games was definitely Mega Man 2. which was released by Capcom in December of 1991, about a full year after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 was released. This game, Mega Man 2, is considered one of the best 8-bit Nintendo games ever made, and I think I agree with that. Although I definitely like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 better, Mega Man 2 was a super fun game to play, no doubt about that. In the game, you play as a heroic robot named Mega Man, and your mission is to defeat the evil Dr. Wily, who has made 8 evil robots you must battle first. This means there are 8 levels to beat, 1 for each robot. When you start the game, there is a menu where you actually get to choose which level and which robot you want to take on first. As far as the 8 robots go, there is Metal Man, Air Man, Bubble Man, Quick Man, Crash Man, Flash Man, Heat Man, and Wood Man. I think Wind Man and Heat Man were my favorites. Wood Man was also a fun one, if I remember correctly. So those would be my go-to levels when I played the game. Another game I played a lot around this time was Tetris, which was released in 1989 by Nintendo, but developed by a Russian named Alexei Pajitnov, and I probably butchered that name. I'm sorry, Alexei Pajitnov. Alexei Pajitnov. Tetris was seemingly such a simple game, but also addicting, and you could play it for hours and hours. There was something about the music that would almost put you into a trance, and as soon as you knew it, you could be sitting on your living room rug for hours playing the game when it only seemed like minutes. Seriously, it was like entering some kind of time warp. The other strange phenomenon about Tetris was that if you played the game a lot, you could never get your mind off of it. You would literally be lying in your bed trying to go to sleep, but you would still be seeing Tetris pieces in your mind's eye, and you'd still be trying to fit all the puzzle pieces together. This wasn't a great thing if you already suffered from anxiety or insomnia. During the early 1990s, I also spent a lot of time playing Super Mario Bros. 3. But if I'm going to talk about Super Mario Bros. 3, I have to first talk about the movie The Wizard. The Wizard features a boy named Corey, played by Fred Savage, and his little gaming wizard brother Jimmy, played by Luke Edwards, the latter of whom is suffering from PTSD, and he may even be borderline autistic. The two boys hitch their way across America so Jimmy can play in a World Video Game Championship in California. Well, the real reason why Jimmy wants to go to California is because he has this pleasant memory of being there with his twin sister who died tragically when she was young, hence why Jimmy has the PTSD. But along the way to California, Corey discovers Jimmy is a video gaming wizard, and he coaxes his little brother into entering the video game championship so they can win money and also prove Jimmy is smart and doesn't belong in an institution. In their travels, they meet a runaway girl named Haley, played by Jenny Lewis, who tags along with them, and she too likes the idea of winning some money to solve her own personal problems. The movie also stars Beau Bridges, probably butchering that name, I never get that name right. And a lot of people forget Christian Slater was in this too. He plays the older brother of both Corey and Jimmy. The movie is filled with all sorts of product placement by Nintendo. It features games like Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden, Rad Racer, and the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, not to be mistaken with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. The Power Glove also makes an appearance in this movie. It's worn by Jimmy's main video gamer rival named Lucas. Lucas has this famous line that everybody knows by now where he says, "I love the Power Glove. It's so bad." All right, let's try that again. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad. It's so bad. It's so bad. More importantly, however, at the end of the movie, during the big climactic third act, where Jimmy plays in the big video game competition at Universal Studios California, the not yet released Super Mario Bros. 3 is unveiled to the world. Yes, this was literally the world premiere of the game, and it got people super excited about it. It was going to essentially be a bigger, better, faster version of the first Super Mario Bros. With all sorts of new levels, basically pretending that Super Mario Bros. 2 never existed. Not that Super Mario 2 was bad, at least not in my opinion. It was just strange and different. And this was mainly because the game was a modified version of another Japanese game called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic. They basically took that game, deleted the characters in it, added Mario characters, and voila, you got Super Mario Bros. 2. This was why you didn't have any Coopers or Bowsers in the game. Instead, you had Birdos, Mousers, and a frog named Wart. Super Mario Bros. 3, however, was a completely original game that is not a modified version of a pre-existing Japanese game like Doki Doki Panic. The game definitely felt like the actual sequel to the first Super Mario Bros., where Super Mario Bros. 2 felt more like, well, an experiment. But again, I like Super Mario Bros. 2, and a lot of other people do as well. I actually love that game to death. Anyway, you have to understand how big of a deal it was when the Wizard unveiled Super Mario Bros. 3 to the world. Everyone was shocked, and I for one thought it was fake, that they made the game up for the movie's sake. Of course, there was no internet back then, so you couldn't look up what was real or what was fake. You kind of just went by rumors and word of mouth. But I guess I eventually realized it was a real game because it was officially released in February of 1990, just a few months after The Wizard had come out. Although I never bought the game, this was another cart that I borrowed from a friend and I never returned. Sorry about that, Tim. Oh man, I loved Super Mario Bros. 3. They were better graphics, a lot smoother gameplay, funner levels, including a giant level where all the enemies and question boxes are enormous. And the coolest thing of all was that you could fly, with the super leaf, that is, which turned you into a raccoon. I'm not sure why it turned you into a raccoon as opposed to a bird, since raccoons can't fly, but let's not ask too many questions about that. All I have to do is hear the music from Super Mario Bros. 3, and I'm instantly brought back to Saturday mornings, sitting on my family room carpet, in my jammies, playing the game, probably before I even ate breakfast, or certainly before I brushed my teeth. Up until the Christmas of 1992, I was playing a lot of Super Mario Bros. 3. There was only one thing that got me to stop playing this game, and really got me to stop playing the Nintendo Entertainment System in general. And that one thing was the Super Nintendo. Duh, duh, duh. On Christmas morning of 1992, I woke up and received what was perhaps my favorite Christmas present of all time, the Super Nintendo, along with 2 games, Mario Kart and Final Fight. Well, actually 3 games if you want to include Super Mario World that came with the system. Although I would certainly pop in 8-bit Nintendo games here and there, especially when it came to that aforementioned summer vacation when I tried to beat The Legend of Zelda. The years of me doing any hardcore playing of the 8-bit NES were officially over. They were so fun while they lasted, but it was time to move on to 16-bit graphics games. Games like Super Mario Kart and Final Fight, not to mention Super Mario World, and then later Star Fox and especially Donkey Kong Country. They were just too good to make me want to keep playing the original NES. Although the years of me playing 8-bit Nintendo were short-lived in the great scheme of things, the memories are forever. All right, thank you very much for listening to that episode of the Burnzo Cast. I hope you enjoyed that. Hope it brought back some pleasant memories for you, made you feel all warm and nostalgic inside. Now, if you did like this episode, you may like my article called I Used to Be a Gamer, the 8-bit Nintendo Years, which is available on my website, theburnzodiaries.com, and also available as an ebook on amazon.com. Most of what I covered in this podcast is in that article, but if you're really interested in 8-bit Nintendo, or maybe you're doing research for a book or an article or something like that, you may want to give that ebook a read, just to reiterate some of the points I made in this podcast episode. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Hopefully more episodes will be on the way. And hey, can you do me a flavor? Please be well. And also do me one more flavor. Take care of yourself, guys. Until next time, Burnzo Nation. Hey everyone, if you want to check out my writing, be sure to check out my blog, theburnzodiaries.com. And also check out my books at amazon.com. I have many novels there, including Johnny Cruise, Supermarket Zombies, Weird Monster, The Woman and the Dragon, and I also have many Kindle singles there and other books, including memoirs. So be sure to check out my blog, theburnzodiaries.com, and also my books at amazon.com.